Hey guys, tonight we are going to drift away on a story of numbers, risk, and what it truly means to build something from nothing, lose it all, and then have the audacity to build it all over again. Picture this for a moment, that low, quiet hum in your room right now. Maybe it's a fan, maybe it's the refrigerator in the kitchen. For so many people, that quiet hum is drowned out by the buzzing anxiety of money, the weight of a credit card bill, the pressure of a business on the edge. But imagine a different kind of quiet, a silence born not of dread, but of peace, the calm confidence of knowing you've built something that can withstand the storms. Tonight's story is about a man who has known both kinds of quiet, more loudly than almost anyone else. This might be the most important bedtime story you'll ever hear about going broke and getting rich again, which, let's be honest, is a terrible topic for trying to fall asleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how spread out our little community is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the warm, humid air of Epe, a town in Nigeria's Lagos state, a young boy named Femi Otedola moved through a world of quiet, disciplined order. His home was not an opulent palace filled with the flashy trinkets of wealth, but an island of profound structure. His father, Sir Michael Otedola, a man who would one day govern Lagos state, was first and foremost an architect of routine. To the young Femi, this was the primary lesson of his childhood, absorbed not through lectures, but through the very atmosphere of his home. He watched his father's day unfold not as a series of chaotic sprints, but as a calm, deliberate procession from one task to the next. He saw the way papers were arranged on his desk, the measured tone of his voice on the telephone, the unyielding sanctity of a schedule. This was his first unspoken education in business. Success was not a lightning strike of genius, but the patient, almost tedious, laying of one brick of discipline upon another. Business leaders still argue whether a founder's instincts are born or made. For Femi, the line was blurry. He felt an innate stirring, a way of seeing the world not just as a place to live, but as a series of interconnected systems of needs and wants, of problems and potential solutions. This instinct was then nurtured, shaped, and given a framework by the quiet predictability of his father's world. It was the sort of organized childhood that either forges a titan of industry or someone who later spends a fortune on therapy to learn how to be spontaneous. He had the uncanny ability to see commerce in everything. A friend's untied shoelace wasn't a problem, it was an unmet demand for a shoe-tying service. It was a useful talent, though it likely didn't make him the most carefree playmate. This instinct soon found its first commercial expression. Noticing that his father and his friends often had untrimmed fingernails, he launched his first enterprise. He wasn't just a boy with clippers. He was a sole proprietor in the personal grooming space. He carefully recorded his clients and earnings in a small notebook. Taking it a step further, he drew up a formal invoice, itemizing his services, and presented it to his father. It was an early and perhaps slightly alarming indicator that he viewed the family home not just as a home, but as a potential market with an unmet demand. He was learning the mechanics of a transaction: identify a need, provide a service, document the value, and request payment. All of this was happening against the backdrop of a nation in dramatic flux. The Nigeria of the 1970s was being reshaped by a colossal oil boom. The discovery of black gold was creating staggering new wealth and transforming the very fabric of the economy. From his quiet, orderly home, he could hear the distant hum of this new world being born, a world of high-stakes deals he would one day come to dominate. Even the very concept of money was changing beneath his feet. In 1973, while he was busy perfecting his invoicing system, the country itself was doing a massive financial rebrand. switching from the Nigerian pound to the naira. For a boy already fascinated by systems, it was a powerful subconscious lesson. Money itself was just an agreement, a story people decided to believe in, and sometimes the story could change overnight. His father's influence was less about direct business advice and more about this pervasive atmosphere of integrity and order. He saw the deep respect his father commanded, a respect born not of fear, but of trust. People trusted Sir Michael's word. He was a man whose name was his bond. Femi internalized this truth, filing it away. A good name, he learned, was a form of currency, perhaps the most stable and valuable one of all. This lesson, learned in the quiet hallways of his youth, would one day become the single most important asset he possessed, the bedrock of his survival when all other currencies had failed him. He was being forged in this crucible of quiet observation. While other children were climbing trees, he was mentally constructing business plans. The foundation was being laid, brick by disciplined brick. He had learned the theory of structure in the most intimate way possible, by living inside it. But theory could only take a young man so far. Soon, he would have to step out from the governor's house, away from the protective umbrella of order and reputation, and into the messy, unpredictable real world. He was about to discover that the world did not run on his father's precise timetable, and that it cared little for a beautifully crafted invoice. It only cared about results. And so he stepped into that world armed with the compass of his father's discipline, but utterly naive about the terrain. He quickly found that the real world of commerce was a swamp of unpredictability, a place where the neat theories of order and structure were tested at every turn. His first real venture was a logical one, an entry into a business his family knew well, printing. It felt safe, a familiar world of ink and paper. He established a small marketing and printing company, full of youthful ambition. His powerful family name could open doors, but he knew that once he was inside the room, he was entirely on his own. He quickly learned that the quiet, predictable order of his father's house was a distant memory. His days became a frantic dance of chasing leads, negotiating with suppliers, and struggling to keep the clanking, groaning printing machines operational. The work was physical and visceral. He quickly learned that the printing business smelled less like fresh money and more like industrial solvent, a perfume that had a way of clinging to a person's clothes long after the workday was done. He was operating at the tail end of an era, seeing the last days of the old letterpress world, where heavy blocks of type were set by hand. It was a messy, tactile craft, a world away from the clean abstraction of a business plan. It was a constant, greasy reminder of how many things could go wrong. Economists still argue whether the biggest barrier for new businesses is a lack of capital or a lack of market access. For the young Femi Otedola, it felt like a false choice. The answer was a painful, resounding both. He needed clients to generate cash, but he needed cash to buy the paper and ink to serve the clients. It was a classic entrepreneurial trap that filled his nights with anxious calculations. He spent his days projecting an aura of calm capability, and his nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how he would make payroll. This personal struggle was set against the backdrop of a difficult period in Nigeria's history. The 1980s was an era of economic instability and military rule, which created a business environment that was both treacherous and full of hidden opportunities. Navigating the bureaucracy for something as simple as an import license for a spare part was a marathon of patience. The environment didn't just reward the smartest or the best connected, it rewarded the most tenacious. Then came his first big contract. The feeling was electric, a surge of validation that washed away the weeks of anxiety. He sat with the client, confident and eager, and quoted a price that felt fair. The deal was sealed with a handshake. For a fleeting moment, he felt like a true captain of industry, the successor to his father's legacy of quiet competence. Then the execution began, and with it, the real lesson. The price he had quoted was based on a perfect world scenario. It hadn't accounted for the sudden spike in the cost of imported paper. It hadn't factored in his main printing press breaking down for 3 agonizing days. And it certainly hadn't allowed for the client calling with a few small changes that required a complete and costly reset of the entire print run. Each problem was another leak in his financial boat. The imagined profit evaporated, replaced by the desperate, frantic goal of simply breaking even and delivering on his promise. His reputation, he knew, was on the line. He and his small team worked around the clock, fueled by adrenaline and cheap coffee. The smell of ink and solvent was now the smell of survival. He pushed, he pleaded, he improvised. Finally, exhausted but proud, he delivered the finished product. The quality was good. He had done it. But the battle wasn't over. He still had to get paid. He submitted his invoice and waited. A week passed, then 2. He made a polite phone call and was met with polite assurances. More weeks passed. His own suppliers were now calling him, their politeness wearing thin. He was trapped in a cash flow vise, learning the visceral, gut-wrenching difference between revenue on a spreadsheet and cash in the bank. He discovered a universal truth. The most creative fiction writers in the world are not novelists, but clients who owe you money. Their excuses were masterpieces of the genre. Eventually, the payment arrived. He sat down, weary to his bones, and did the final math. After paying everyone he owed, the magnificent profit he had envisioned had shrunk to almost nothing. He had endured weeks of immense stress and had barely anything to show for it. This was his real-world MBA. The tuition was paid in sleepless nights, and the final exam was a gut-wrenching look at a bank statement that showed almost no profit. The experience was humbling and brutal, and it was the most valuable education he could ever receive. He understood now. A good idea, starting a printing company, was worthless. The value, the profit, the entire substance of a business was in its execution. It was in the boring, unglamorous details of cost control, risk management, and getting paid on time. He did not get discouraged. He got smarter. He learned to build contingencies into his pricing. He learned to demand a deposit. He learned to write tighter contracts. Each mistake was a scar that taught a lesson. This small, struggling business was his training ground, teaching him the grit that the orderly world of his childhood never could. And though he didn't know it yet, this painful, ink-stained education was preparing him for a much, much bigger game. The lessons of the printing press, hard-won and paid for in sweat and sleepless nights, were now etched into his business DNA. He had learned about the brutal mechanics of cash flow and the non-negotiable importance of execution. But the most profound lesson was one of scale. The daily grind of the printing business felt small, the rewards too meager for the immense effort required. A restless energy began to stir within him. His mind, trained in his father's house to see large, interconnected systems, started scanning the horizon for a much bigger game. He was searching for a problem so fundamental, so widespread, that a solution would represent not just a business, but an entire industry. And he found it in the daily, rhythmic silence that fell over the city of Lagos. It was a pattern as predictable as the sunrise. First, the steady hum of a working city. The lights, the air conditioners, the whir of machinery would abruptly cease. A brief, startling quiet would descend before thousands of diesel generators kicked in. This happened everywhere. It happened at the banks, factories, opulent homes of the wealthy, and at his own printing press, where the silence threatened his deadlines. The national power grid, managed by the National Electric Power Authority, NEPA, operated less like a modern utility and more like a temperamental rock star, only showing up to perform when it felt like it, which was rarely. The cynical public had long since rechristened the national power grid, "Never expect power always." Most people complained about the unreliable service, viewing it as a daily frustration, a tax on their patience and productivity. But Femi Otedola began to see it differently. He trained his mind to stop hearing an annoyance and to start hearing a colossal business opportunity. He realized the true national anthem of Nigerian commerce wasn't a song, but the sputtering, off-key chorus of 1,000,000 generators kicking in at once. Every single one of those machines, from the smallest to the largest, was thirsty. They all ran on diesel. He was surrounded by a captive market of desperate customers whose very survival depended on a constant supply of this one fuel. Business theorists still debate whether true market opportunities are created by entrepreneurs or simply discovered. Otedola did not create Nigeria's power crisis. That was a systemic failure decades in the making. But he discovered a massive, unexploited gap in the solution. His foundational moment of vision was not just in realizing that people needed diesel. That was obvious. His genius was in understanding how they were getting it. He investigated and found a supply chain that was utterly broken. A typical bank manager, for example, couldn't just order fuel. He had to dispatch an employee with a fistful of cash and empty barrels to a petrol station, hoping they had stock. The employee would then have to haggle over the price, pray the fuel wasn't adulterated, and manage the messy, insecure process of hauling it back. For a large corporation with hundreds of locations, it was a logistical nightmare. This was the true pain point. The opportunity wasn't just in selling a commodity, it was in solving a chronic, nationwide headache. He saw a market defined by chaos, unreliability, and a total lack of professionalism. It was an industry that operated in the shadows, often overlapping with the murky world of bunkering, the local term for the illicit and often dangerous trade in stolen petroleum products. To his mind, with its ingrained need for structure and order, the path forward was brilliantly clear. He would bring order to this chaos. The idea that crystallized was simple but revolutionary. He wouldn't just sell diesel. He would sell a professional, seamless logistics service. He would sell peace of mind. He would create a company with a fleet of large, modern tanker trucks that would deliver fuel directly to the customer's doorstep. He would offer scheduled, reliable deliveries, transparent billing, and quality assurance. He would replace the rusty barrels and the back alley deals with contracts and corporate efficiency. In essence, he would become the reliable utility that the state had failed to be. He decided to pivot from paper to petroleum. It was a move a bit like going from running a local bakery to trying to buy the entire world's supply of wheat. The stakes were astronomically higher. He was leaving a familiar world for the opaque, high-risk universe of oil and gas, an industry of giants. But the scale of the opportunity was too vast to ignore. The painful lessons from the printing press now became his greatest assets. He knew he had to master his cash flow, so he designed his new business model around a core principle: his customers would pay up front. This single brilliant stroke eliminated the problem of chasing debts that had almost crippled him before. The vision was now fully formed, vivid and potent. He could see the clean, branded trucks moving through the city, symbols of a new kind of reliability. He had found his big problem, one woven into the very fabric of the nation's economy, and he had found his elegant, scalable solution. The boy who once invoiced his father for a manicure was now about to build an empire on the relentless thirst of 1,000,000 diesel generators. The dream was there. Now came the hard part, turning it into reality. The dream was powerful, but it was also weightless, an idea suspended in the air. To give it substance, to turn it into steel and diesel and payroll, required capital on a scale he had never handled before. The ghosts of the printing press, with its painful lessons in being underfunded, haunted him. He vowed not to make that same mistake again. This vision was too big for half measures. And so he prepared to face the bankers. He walked into the cold, marble-floored lobbies of Nigeria's major banks, temples of commerce where fortunes were made and unmade. His family name, still a currency of immense value, got him the meetings in the hushed, intimidating boardrooms. But he knew a good name only gets you a cup of coffee. A bulletproof business plan is what secures a multi-million-dollar loan. He laid out his vision with a clarity that was startling in its simplicity. He wasn't pitching a speculative tech venture or a complex financial instrument. His pitch was so obvious, it was brilliant. You know how the power is always out, and it's a massive headache for everyone, including your own bank branches? I'm selling the stuff that turns the lights back on, and my customers will pay me before I even deliver it. The bankers, living in the very same generator-dependent reality, understood the model instantly. It was a solution to their own operational nightmare, and his prepaid model dramatically minimized their lending risk. He was also pitching at a uniquely opportune moment. The Nigerian banking sector of the late 1990s was in a state of dynamic liberalization. A new, aggressive generation of bank leaders was hungry for growth and willing to finance ambitious ventures, especially in the lucrative oil and gas sector. They saw the logic, they saw his drive, and they saw the almost infinite demand. The loan was approved. The dream now had fuel. He christened the new company Zenon Petroleum and Gas. The name sounded solid, global, and powerful. With the bank's money secured, he made his first major purchases. He didn't lease a glamorous office in a high-rise or acquire a fleet of executive cars. He bought tanker trucks, big, loud, diesel-guzzling, utterly unglamorous tanker trucks. They were the least flashy assets imaginable, but to him, they were the most beautiful things in the world. Each one was a rolling promise of reliability, a physical manifestation of his vision. This roaring, diesel-powered reality he had built now possessed a gravity all its own. Zenon was no longer a nimble startup, but a formidable force in the Nigerian economy. Its trucks a constant, reassuring presence on the nation's highways. The name Zenon was fast becoming synonymous with energy itself. But with this new scale came a new dynamic. He was no longer the scrappy underdog fighting for a foothold. He was now the heavyweight champion, the one everyone else was watching. The game had shifted from creation to outright domination. His competitors were a scattered bunch, a mix of small-time operators with a couple of trucks and larger, established fuel companies that treated diesel as a low-priority side business. They were accustomed to a sleepy market with high margins and lazy service. They were, in short, completely unprepared for the level of focus and aggression he was about to unleash. They watched in a state of bewilderment as he began to systematically dismantle their customer bases, not with charm, but with the brutal efficiency of a superior system. His most powerful weapon was the one he had fought so hard to create: his absolute control over the entire supply chain. By chartering his own ships and importing diesel directly from European refineries, he had cut out the layers of middlemen. This vertical integration was his strategic masterpiece. While his rivals were still haggling for supply at the local depots, he was negotiating multi-million-dollar deals on the international market. This led to the foundational principle of his conquest, economies of scale. It's a simple business concept, but in his hands, it became a devastating weapon. When a competitor bought diesel by the truckload, they paid a certain price. When he bought it by the shipload, 20,000 metric tons at a time, he paid a profoundly lower price per liter. This unassailable cost advantage allowed him to initiate a price war that he was mathematically guaranteed to win. He began to aggressively lower Zenon's prices, just enough to be irresistible to the market. His competitors were caught in a death spiral. They could either hold their prices and watch their customers abandon them, or they could try to match his price and lose money on every single sale. His competitors, accustomed to a sleepy, comfortable market, awoke to find he had not only eaten their lunch, but had also sold them the napkins at a discount. They were, to put it mildly, perplexed. But he knew that a business built solely on being the cheapest was vulnerable. Business leaders still argue whether market dominance is best achieved through aggressive price competition or through superior service and brand differentiation. He looked at this debate and decided not to choose one. He would do both. At the very same time he was waging a price war, he invested heavily in building an impeccable brand. His trucks were always clean and well-maintained, a stark contrast to the rusty, leaking tankers of his rivals. His drivers were trained to be professional and courteous. His delivery schedules were treated as sacred promises. He was building the kind of brand loyalty usually reserved for tech companies with fruit logos. Businesses weren't just his customers. They were Zenon converts, preaching the gospel of reliable fuel delivery. He was selling the cheapest product and the best service simultaneously. It was a combination the market had never seen, and it was utterly overwhelming. His life became a relentless exercise in logistics. His new hobby became staring at shipping manifests. He developed a level of expertise in maritime logistics that made him fascinating to a very small group of people, namely customs agents and harbor masters. He would obsessively track the movements of his chartered vessels across the ocean using data from publications like Lloyd's List, the centuries-old Bible of the maritime industry. He knew the precise location of every ship, its cargo, and its exact arrival time. He wasn't just in the oil business, he was in the information business, possessing a god's-eye view of a market his competitors could only guess at. The results of this strategy were staggering. Zenon's market share exploded. Within a few short years, he went from being a new entrant to the undisputed king of the diesel market, capturing over 70% of the entire sector. His client list was a who's who of corporate Nigeria. The biggest banks, the largest manufacturers, the leading telecom companies, even the presidential residence. They all ran on Zenon diesel. The cash flow was immense, and the debt-fueled growth strategy had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. The machine was humming perfectly, spitting out cash at an unbelievable rate. He stood at the absolute pinnacle of his game, having conquered a market through strategic brilliance and a relentless focus on execution. The boy who was trained by the quiet order of his father's home had now imposed his own order on a chaotic industry, and the rewards were beyond measure. From his high-rise office, he could look out over the sprawling city of Lagos and know, in a very real sense, that he was the one powering it. The feeling was intoxicating. It was the feeling of being invincible. And that, perhaps, is the most dangerous feeling of all. The empire he had built was a marvel, but its foundations were set on two pillars: the price of a single commodity and the endless flow of credit. He had become the master of a single game, not yet realizing that the rules of the game itself could change in an instant without any warning at all. And then in an instant, the rules of the game changed. In the summer of 2008, Femi Otedola stood at the summit, the undisputed king of a mountain he had built with his own hands. Zenon was a behemoth. His personal wealth had soared past the billion-dollar mark, and he was celebrated as a titan of African industry. The system he had created felt perfect, a flawless engine for generating wealth. He felt, for all intents and purposes, untouchable. But the ground beneath his mountain was beginning to shake, rattled by a tremor on the other side of the world. It began as a distant rumble, a headline flashing across a news screen. A storied American investment bank, Lehman Brothers, had collapsed. Economists still argue about the primary cause of the 2008 crash, debating whether it was a failure of regulation, a flaw in financial innovation, or simple human greed. For Otedola, the academic debate was irrelevant. All he knew was that this event, happening thousands of miles away, had just lit the fuse on a bomb sitting directly underneath his empire. The intricate web of global finance began to unravel. Confidence evaporated, and the price of oil, the very bedrock of his fortune, began to fall. It didn't just fall, it plummeted. It was a free fall off a cliff. From a historic high of $147 a barrel in July, the price crashed to below $40 by December. The number that underpinned his entire business had lost over 70% of its value in less than 6 months. Obscure but vital indicators of global trade that he monitored, like the Baltic Dry Index, a measure of shipping costs, collapsed, signaling that the entire world economy was seizing up. For him, this was not a theoretical disaster on a screen. It was a very real, very personal catastrophe playing out on the high seas. He had massive shiploads of diesel, purchased weeks ago at the peak price, making their slow journey to Nigeria. Each vessel was a floating treasury, an asset worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But by the time they arrived in the port of Lagos, their market value was less than half of what he had paid. He was contractually obligated to buy at the old, high price and forced to sell at the new, collapsed price. Each docking ship delivered another hammer blow to his finances. The machine that was designed to print money had transformed into a roaring incinerator, burning through his capital with every liter he sold. Then came the second blow. As the price of its main export collapsed, Nigeria was plunged into its own economic crisis. The central bank was forced to devalue the nation's currency, the naira. All of the massive loans that had fueled Zenon's expansion were denominated in US dollars. Overnight, the cost of repaying that debt in naira skyrocketed. A dollar-denominated loan that cost him one amount to service one day cost him a dramatically larger amount the next. He was trapped in a perfect storm. He was earning devalued naira from selling his product at a massive loss, and he had to use this depreciated currency to repay foreign debts that had just become monumentally larger. The beautiful, elegant cycle of leverage that had propelled his rise now reversed course with terrifying speed. He learned the hard way that leverage is a fantastic friend on the way up. On the way down, however, it's the friend who cheerfully hands you an anchor while you're drowning. The phones, once ringing with allies and partners, now rang with the shrill, panicked demands of creditors. The same bankers who had practically begged him to take their money just months before now looked at him as if he had walked into the boardroom carrying a live alligator. Their smiles had been replaced by abacuses. They were facing their own global meltdown and were calling in every loan they could, starting with their biggest and most vulnerable clients. He went from being lauded as man of the year to the man who owed everyone a year's worth of GDP in the space of a few months. From a net worth of over 1.5 billion, he had fallen to a net debt of over $1.2 billion. Everything he had built was gone. The company was worthless, its assets completely eclipsed by the colossal, crushing weight of what he owed. He had hit rock bottom. The roaring engine of Zenon had fallen silent. The energy, the ambition, the feeling of invincibility had all been replaced by a cold, terrifying stillness. He was facing a total wipeout, the kind of financial cataclysm that destroys not just businesses, but people. The entire world, which had watched his ascent with awe, now watched his fall with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The mountain he had built had crumbled into dust. The mountain had crumbled into dust, and for a time he just sat in the silence of the ruins. The frantic energy of the crash had passed, replaced by the cold, heavy reality of the numbers on a page. The debt was a figure so large it felt abstract, a monster from a distant land. Over $1 billion. It was a financial black hole, threatening to pull in and extinguish everything he had ever been. The calls from creditors, once panicked, now took on the steely, procedural tone of lawyers. The very real legal threat of a Mareva injunction, a court order that could freeze every asset to his name, hung in the air like a guillotine. In the quiet of his office late at night, the city lights twinkling below, a war raged within him. It was a battle between two powerful voices. The first was the voice of his ego, the voice of the conqueror who had built this empire. It screamed at him to hold on. Don't sell, it urged. Markets are cyclical. Oil will rebound. To sell now is to admit defeat. It is to let them win. But there was another voice, quieter and calmer. It was the voice of the pragmatist forged in the ink-stained chaos of the printing press. It whispered a harder truth. The game is over. The assets are no longer yours. They belong to your creditors. Holding on is not strength, it is delusion. The only way out is to let go. Psychologists still debate how much of a high-stakes business decision is driven by rational calculation versus emotional instinct and ego. Femi Otedola was a living embodiment of this debate. His ego wanted to fight a battle that was already lost. His rational mind knew that the only way to win the long war for his future was to surrender this battle completely. He was trapped in a classic psychological pitfall, the sunk cost fallacy. He had poured his life, his soul, and billions of dollars into building Zenon. Every instinct screamed at him to protect that investment, to justify the immense cost. But the rational part of his mind understood a brutal truth. The money was already gone. Clinging to the wreckage now would not bring it back. It would only ensure he drowned along with it. After days of sleepless nights, pacing the floors of his office, a moment of profound clarity cut through the internal noise. He asked himself a simple, devastating question. What was he really trying to save? The true core asset was not the fleet of trucks or the massive depots. It was his name, his reputation. It was the intangible currency his father had taught him about all those years ago. A business could be rebuilt, an empire could be reconquered, but a name once destroyed by broken promises and unpaid debts was lost forever. In that moment, the decision was made. It was the hardest, most painful, and most unthinkable decision of his life. He would sell, he would liquidate, he would dismantle the empire piece by painful piece until every single creditor was paid in full. His goal shifted from saving Zenon to clearing my name. His ego, which just months prior had been large enough to have its own gravitational pull, had now shrunk to the size of a crumpled napkin. It turns out $1 billion debt is a very effective shrinking agent. He called a meeting with the heads of the banks he owed money to. He walked into that boardroom a different man. The swagger of the billionaire was gone, replaced by a stark, sober humility. He didn't come with excuses or pleas for more time. He came with a proposal for a total and complete surrender of his assets. He laid out a list of over 140 properties, depots, and vessels. "I will sell all of this," he told them, "and the proceeds will go directly to you. I am choosing to do this myself, to manage the liquidation, to ensure you get as much of your money back as possible." He was left with two basic options: bankruptcy or a fire sale. Bankruptcy was the neat, orderly demolition of his life's work. The fire sale was like inviting a mob to do it with torches. He chose the fire sale, hoping he could at least control the flames. The bankers were stunned. They were used to debtors who hid assets, who fought in court for years. They were not used to a debtor who walked in and handed over the keys to the kingdom. They agreed to his plan. And so the great dismantling began. It was an excruciating process. Each sale was a public marker of his failure. The massive fuel depot in Apapa, the very heart of his logistical empire, was one of the first to go. The very assets that once graced the glossy covers of his annual reports were now just items on a liquidation list. Each transaction was a cut, a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. But with each sale, something else happened. A small fraction of the billion-dollar weight was lifted from his shoulders. It was a painful, humiliating, and deeply humbling process. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like he was moving forward, not just sinking. He had confronted his ego, and he had chosen to live. He had confronted his ego, and he had chosen to live. But this choice did not lead to a swift or easy peace. It led to a long, grinding, and profoundly unglamorous period of meticulous labor. The art of the comeback he was about to learn is not a dramatic, cinematic event. It is a marathon run in the dark, with no finish line in sight and no crowds to cheer you on. His life, once a whirlwind of international deals and high-stakes growth, had become a masterclass in spreadsheet management. He'd traded first-class lounges for the beige purgatory of conference rooms where the coffee was always stale, but the stakes were higher than ever. His days were now consumed by the painstaking process of deconstruction. He was no longer a builder of empires, but a manager of its orderly demolition, selling off assets one by one to chip away at the mountain of debt. He spent more time with lawyers and accountants than with his own family. He even started to understand their dry, technical jokes, which he correctly identified as a terrifying sign that he'd been in this process for far too long. Each day was a battle of attrition, a test of pure endurance. Then, the landscape of his struggle shifted dramatically. His debt, along with the bad loans of other major players, was so colossal that it had become a threat to the stability of Nigeria's entire banking system. In response, the government made a sweeping move. In 2010, it established the Asset Management Corporation of Nigeria, AMCON, a so-called bad bank, created with the sole purpose of buying up these massive, non-performing loans to clean up the commercial bank's balance sheets. His billion-dollar debt was transferred from the dozen banks he owed to this single, powerful government institution. This changed everything. On one hand, he was no longer dealing with a frantic consortium of creditors. On the other, he now faced a single, bureaucratic monolith with the full power of the state behind it. The creation of entities like AMCON is a complex issue. Financial experts still debate the moral hazard of government bailouts, questioning whether they encourage excessive risk-taking by creating a safety net for failure. His personal crisis was now a case study in a national economic debate. But for him, it wasn't theoretical. It was the new, complex reality he had to navigate. The negotiation with AMCON became a slow, painstaking process. It was a world of deep financial forensics, where he had to understand complex restructuring options like debt for equity swaps, where a creditor might take an ownership stake in a company instead of a cash payment. This is where the discipline instilled in him during his childhood, the quiet order of his father's world, became his most critical tool for survival. He was meticulously organized. He was transparent. He provided every document, answered every question, and showed up to every meeting thoroughly prepared. He was not fighting them. He was collaborating in the dismantling of his own past, proving his integrity with every spreadsheet and every file he produced. This was a lonely, isolating period. The world that had celebrated his rise was quick to shun him in his fall. Many so-called friends and allies vanished. The invitations dried up. In many of the circles he once dominated, he was now a pariah, a walking cautionary tale. His comeback was not a public spectacle. It was a quiet, intensely personal battle fought in boardrooms and in the even quieter chambers of his own mind, a daily struggle against the temptation of despair. He focused on the numbers. Watching his debt go down was like watching a glacier recede. He knew it was happening, but the daily progress was so imperceptible, it felt like a hallucination. He learned to celebrate a 0.1% reduction the way he used to celebrate a $100 million contract. Finally, after years of this relentless, methodical grind, a breakthrough. He and Amcon reached a final settlement. The number was still astronomical, but it was a concrete, finite figure. For the first time since the crash, he had a finish line. The black hole now had a bottom. The path out of the darkness was clear, even if it was still long and steep. With the agreement in hand, he executed the final, most painful sales, liquidating the last of Zenon's crown jewel assets to make the payment. The era of Zenon, the company that had made him a billionaire and then broken him, was officially over. He had done it. He had navigated the single largest personal debt restructuring in Nigerian history. The storm had passed. He was no longer drowning. He was standing on the shore, battered and exhausted, with only a fraction of his former empire left. He was no longer defined by the $1 billion he made or the $1 billion he lost. He was now defined by the quiet, relentless, multi-year determination to pay it all back. The slate was almost clean, but the question that hung in the quiet air was a heavy one. What now? Could a man who had lost it all truly begin again? The slate was almost clean, the great debt settled. But the question that hung in the quiet air was a heavy one. What now? Could a man who had lost it all truly begin again? The answer lay not in a brilliant new idea, but in the forgotten remnants of his old empire. In the portfolio of assets that had survived the Great Fire Sale, he still held a controlling stake in a publicly listed company called African Petroleum, or AP. He had acquired it during the boom years, another piece on his ever-expanding chessboard. Now, in the quiet aftermath, it was almost all he had left. He turned his full attention to it, and what he found was a corporate disaster. African Petroleum was a legacy company, a sleeping giant that had fallen into a deep coma. When he first looked at the books, he concluded it had been run with the financial discipline of a lottery winner on a week-long bender. It was, to use a technical term, a complete mess. The company was crippled by its own internal debts, its assets were rotting, its brand was a joke, and its share price was languishing in the gutter of the stock exchange. To any rational observer, it looked like a lost cause. To him, it was a lifeline. It was his one chance to prove that the devastating lessons of the Zenon crash had not been in vain. He approached this new challenge as a fundamentally different man. The gunslinging, debt-fueled, growth-at-all-costs entrepreneur of the Zenon years was gone, burned away in the crucible of the crash. The man who now took the chairman's seat at African Petroleum was sober, cautious, and newly obsessed with the one thing he had so disastrously neglected before: structure. The lessons of his father's quiet, orderly world, which he had once admired but then ignored in his meteoric rise, now came roaring back as his guiding principle. This time, he would not build on the sand of leverage, but on the bedrock of good corporate governance. Management theorists still debate whether a successful corporate turnaround is primarily a matter of changing the strategy or changing the culture. He looked at the decay in African Petroleum and knew he had to perform radical surgery on both, simultaneously. The strategy of the old AP was one of neglect. Its culture was one of complacency. Both had to be ripped out by the roots. His first act was symbolic but crucial. He decided to kill the name African Petroleum and the toxic legacy associated with it. He rebranded the company as Forte Oil Reinvention. It sounded strong, solid, and forward-looking. It also sounded a bit Italian, which has a way of making everything, including a petrol station, seem just a little more sophisticated. It was a public declaration that the old ways were dead, new name, new mission. Next, he plunged into the dirty, unglamorous work of restructuring. He cleaned up the contaminated balance sheet, sold off underperforming assets, and paid down the company's debts with a grim, focused determination. He made the entire organization lean and efficient. But the most important change, the one that would define his second act, was his fanatical focus on corporate governance. This became his new religion. In the wake of the 2008 crisis, the entire global business community was demanding more transparency and accountability. He didn't just adopt these ideas, he became their fiercest evangelist. He completely overhauled the board of directors, bringing in respected independent voices. He established proper audit and risk committees. After the chaotic, personality-driven whirlwind of Zenon, he found that boring was beautiful. Boring was safe, boring was profitable. His first annual general meeting as chairman was a trial by fire. He stood before a room full of angry, skeptical shareholders, people who had watched their investment wither away for years. But he didn't offer them charisma or grand promises of explosive growth. He offered them something new, a promise of discipline, transparency, and a slow, methodical return to profitability. He asked them to judge him not on his past, but on the results he was about to deliver, and then slowly but surely, he delivered. The changes began to take root. The company stopped bleeding money. Quarter by quarter, the financial reports improved. Forte Oil moved from a loss to a small profit, then to a bigger one. The culture began to shift from a complacent civil service mentality to one of performance and accountability. The market, once deeply skeptical, began to take notice. Analysts praised the company's transparent management. Investors began to buy the stock. The share price, once in the gutter, began a steady, impressive climb. The success of Forte Oil was a profound vindication. The rise of Zenon had been a spectacle, loud, fast, and ultimately fragile. This success was different. It was quiet, deliberate, and built to last. He had proven that he was not just a lucky speculator who rode an oil boom. He was a builder, a strategist, capable of creating real sustainable value from the most broken of assets. He had not just paid off his personal debts. He had rebuilt his reputation in the full, unforgiving glare of the public markets. He had his second act. A comeback story that was already becoming legendary in the annals of Nigerian business. But this success was built on a single foundational belief, a mantra forged in the fires of his catastrophic failure. It was a lesson he now considered the most important in all of business. Structure trumps all. This wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was the core operating system of his new life. The great, unifying theory that explained both the dizzying rise and cataclysmic fall of Zenon and the slow, steady, and sustainable success of Forte Oil. He had lived both sides of the equation, and he had returned with the answer. He looked back at Zenon with the clear, cold eyes of a man who had survived a shipwreck. He saw it for what it was, a business built entirely around a personality, his. For a time, that had been its greatest advantage. Zenon was fast, agile, and decisive because he was fast, agile, and decisive. But he now understood it was also a direct reflection of his own blind spots, his overconfidence, his unchecked appetite for risk. There were no real guardrails, no independent voices strong enough to challenge his assumptions. The company was an extension of his will. So, when his judgment was flawed, when his bet on the market went catastrophically wrong, there was no system in place to absorb the shock. Forte Oil was his deliberate, painstakingly constructed antithesis. It was a business built not around a personality, but around a system. It was designed to be strong not because he was strong, but because its processes were strong. The old Otedola believed in genius and gut instinct. The new Otedola believed in checklists, committees, and audited reports. It was far less exciting, but it was also infinitely less likely to result in a billion-dollar bonfire fueled by his own money. A business without proper structure, he now knew, was like a massive group chat with no admin and notifications on for everyone. It was pure chaos, nothing important got decided, and everyone eventually gave up. His new philosophy was a direct solution to a classic problem in business. Academics in business ethics still debate the principal-agent problem, which explores the inherent conflict of interest between a company's management, the agent, and its shareholders, the principal. At Zenon, he had effectively been both, accountable to no one but himself. At Forte Oil, he intentionally built a framework to protect the owners of the company, the shareholders, from the potential errors of its managers, including himself. What did this structure look like in practice? It looked like long, formal board meetings with truly independent directors who were empowered and expected to disagree with him. It looked like a rigorous audit committee that scrutinized every major transaction. It looked like clear documented processes for everything from hiring to capital expenditure. He had gone from being a high-flying rule breaker to a passionate rule maker. His new superpower was the ability to sit through a 9-hour audit committee meeting without visibly losing the will to live. It was a skill that impressed a very specific and admittedly very dull group of people, but it was the skill that now safeguarded his entire enterprise. This shift wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was part of a global movement. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the United States, passed after the Enron scandal, had already set a new global standard for corporate accountability. His reforms were an embrace of this new world order. This isn't to say his chosen path of traditional, hierarchical governance was the only way. The world of business is full of experiments in organization. Some modern companies embrace radical concepts like holacracy, a system with no managers and decentralized authority. But he, having stared into the abyss of total failure, was not interested in radical experiments. He was interested in strength, predictability, and resilience. He wanted a structure as solid and dependable as a block of granite. The ultimate goal of this obsession with process was to make himself, the founder, gradually less important. He realized the ultimate test of a well-structured business is whether the founder can go on vacation and the company doesn't immediately implode. For many entrepreneurs, this is the most terrifying thought imaginable. But for him, it was the definition of success. His ambition was no longer just to build a great company, but to build a great company that could outlast him. He now preached this gospel of governance to anyone who would listen. When he saw young, ambitious entrepreneurs building personality-driven businesses, he saw the ghost of Zenon. He understood their impatience with rules and their belief in their own singular vision. He was once exactly like them, but he also knew the price of that hubris. He knew that structure is not the enemy of speed. It is the only thing that ensures you don't crash at high speed. It's the difference between a race car and a rocket ship with no steering wheel. Both are incredibly fast, but only one is designed to finish the race. This philosophy had become his legacy. A company built on the charisma of one person is a gamble, but a company built on the strength of its systems is an institution. A company built on the strength of its systems is an institution, but an institution cannot survive in a vacuum. To thrive, it needs the trust of the outside world, the trust of banks, investors, partners, and customers. He now understood that this was the second great pillar of his post-crash philosophy. Reputation is the ultimate currency. Structure was the internal skeleton that gave his business strength. Reputation was the shield that protected it from the skepticism and dangers of the external world. He often thought back to the lesson from his father's house, watching the way people treated Sir Michael with a deep, abiding respect. As a boy, it had been an abstract concept. A good name is important. But after the crash, this idea became the single most tangible and valuable asset he had left. It was the only thing of value that wasn't on the liquidation list. He owned it outright, and he was faced with a choice. He could either cash it in for a short-term gain by declaring bankruptcy, or he could protect it at all costs, betting that its long-term value was greater than any of the physical assets he was being forced to sell. He was standing at a crossroads. The logical, financially smart move, the one any number of accountants would have advised, was to use the law to wipe the slate clean. It would have been faster and would have allowed him to preserve a portion of his wealth, but it would have utterly destroyed his name. It would have been a public declaration that his promises were conditional, that his word was only good as long as things were going well. He had learned that a good name can get you a meeting, and a great name can get you a loan. A bad name, however, gets your calls sent directly to a voicemail box that is conveniently and permanently full. From a purely financial perspective, choosing to pay back over $1 billion instead of declaring bankruptcy was like choosing to climb Mount Everest in flip-flops. It was the crazier, harder path. And in making this choice, he took a powerful stance in a long-running ethical debate. Ethicists still debate whether a corporation's primary responsibility is to its shareholders to maximize profit or to its stakeholders, including creditors, employees, and customers. By choosing to pay his creditors, his stakeholders in full, he chose to obliterate his own value as Zenon's sole shareholder. He prioritized his obligation to others over his own self-interest. This kind of counterintuitive, reputation-first decision has a famous corporate precedent. In 1982, after a cyanide lacing scare, the company Johnson & Johnson made the hugely expensive decision to recall every single bottle of Tylenol from every shelf in America. Their short-term losses were massive, but the act cemented their reputation for public trust for decades to come. His personal decision was a Tylenol moment on a colossal scale. He sacrificed everything in the short term to protect the one asset he knew was irreplaceable: his word. The legendary investor Warren Buffett famously said, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it." He had lived through his own potential 5 minutes and had made the choice that preserved 20 years of integrity. The payoff for this seemingly irrational decision was not immediate, but it was immense. When he began the Herculean task of turning Forte Oil around, he needed the support of the very same banking community he had just cost a fortune. They extended new lines of credit. They believed in his new vision. Why? Because he had spent years proving, in the most painful way imaginable, that he was a man who paid his debts. His word was good. He had been tested in the fires of hell and had not broken his promise. That kind of trust cannot be bought. It can only be earned through action. He now understood that trust is the most valuable and fragile asset in business. It takes years of consistent behavior to build, a single bad decision to break, and a lifetime of effort to repair. His reputation became the hardest asset on his personal balance sheet. Financial assets will fluctuate, markets will rise and fall, but his integrity, his name, that was the asset that, if guarded fiercely, could never be taken from him. It was the final backstop when all other systems failed. This lesson was the final piece of the puzzle, the one that connected everything else. The discipline his father taught him, the structure he learned to worship, and the reputation he chose to save, They were all interconnected. A business with a strong structure run by people with a weak reputation will eventually fail. A business run by people with a strong reputation but no structure will eventually crash. To build something that lasts, he knew, required both. It required an unshakable foundation of process, and on top of it, an equally unshakable commitment to one's word. It was the ultimate fusion of the lessons of his father and the brutal education of his own failure. This fusion of lessons, the marriage of hard structure and unimpeachable integrity, gave him something new: clarity. With Forte Oil running like a well-oiled machine, a testament to his new philosophy, he was no longer consumed by the daily fight for survival or the frantic pursuit of growth. He had earned the mental space to lift his head, look to the horizon, and think about the deeper currents of the market, the long, slow waves that are often invisible to those caught up in the day-to-day chop. And in that quiet, reflective state, he began to feel a familiar stirring, a sense of foresight that he now trusted more than ever. He looked at the downstream oil and gas sector in Nigeria, the very industry he had now conquered twice. He saw a mature, highly regulated market. He saw the shifting winds of government policy, which could squeeze profit margins overnight. He saw the slow but undeniable global conversation turning towards alternative energy. He saw a cyclical industry, and his bones, having been broken by the last cycle, told him that the peak of the current one was approaching. He knew that anyone who claims they can perfectly predict the market is either a liar or owns a time machine. He didn't own a time machine. He just had a very well-developed sense of when the music at the party was about to stop. Investors and academics still debate whether successful market timing is a result of skill or simply luck. He had experienced the brutal reality of bad luck, and he was in no hurry to test it again. This time, his decision would not be a gamble. It would be a calculated strategic choice, born from decades of experience and scar tissue. He looked at Forte Oil, the company he had resurrected from the ashes, his corporate child, his proof of vindication, and he made a decision that was utterly devoid of sentiment. He decided to sell. This was a lesson that many entrepreneurs never learn. They fall in love with their creations. Many treat their business like a beloved child. He, however, had learned the hard way that you are, in fact, allowed to sell your business if a strategic buyer offers you a fantastic price for it at what you believe is the top of the market. The trauma of the Zenon crash had performed a painful but necessary surgery, severing the emotional bond between his identity and his assets. He now saw his businesses as things he built and managed, but not as things he was. They were investments, and the goal of an investment is to realize its value at the optimal moment. His decision to divest from Forte Oil sent shockwaves through the business community. Why would he sell a healthy, profitable, growing company? Selling a thriving business is like leaving a great party at 11 p.m. Everyone thinks you're crazy, but he knew that often, nothing good happens after midnight. He'd rather go home with fond memories and a pocket full of cash than stay for the messy, regretful end of the night. His strategy was the polar opposite of the cynical, greater fool theory, which is just about finding someone dumber than you to buy an overvalued asset. He wasn't selling a lemon. He was selling a well-run, valuable company based on his fundamental analysis that the sector was facing future headwinds. This move was a direct challenge to the core of the efficient market hypothesis, the academic theory that you can't consistently beat the market. He was betting that his specific, deep, and hard-won industry knowledge gave him an edge that the broader market didn't appreciate yet. The exit was a masterclass in professionalism. There was no desperate fire sale, no panicked phone calls to creditors. This was a calm, orderly, and highly profitable transaction conducted from a position of supreme strength. He signed the final share purchase agreement, and with the stroke of a pen, he was no longer an oil and gas magnate. The cycle was complete. He had entered the market by spotting a gap, dominated it through scale, lost it all in a global crash, rebuilt a champion through structure and integrity, and now he had left the stage on his own terms, at a time of his own choosing. And then his timing was proven to be breathtakingly prescient. In the months and years that followed his exit, the Nigerian downstream sector faced exactly the headwinds he had anticipated. Government regulations changed, margins were squeezed, and the entire industry entered a difficult period. The value of many of his former competitors stagnated or fell. His decision to sell at the peak was hailed as a stroke of genius. The ultimate lesson was now clear. The art of making it big wasn't just about the hustle of building. It wasn't just about the resilience of a comeback. It was also about the wisdom of letting go. Knowing when to exit a market is as crucial and as difficult a skill as knowing when to enter one. It is the final and often most profitable act of a master builder, to know when the work is done and it's time to walk away. He was now debt-free, cash-rich, and his reputation for both integrity and strategic brilliance was cemented. He was no longer just a businessman, he was a master of the game. He was no longer just a businessman, he was a master of the game. He had played it at the highest levels, won, lost everything, and won again. And having reached this pinnacle, having completed the full, brutal cycle, he made the most surprising move of all. He chose to walk away from the game board. With the proceeds from the Forte Oil sale, he was immensely liquid, unburdened by debt, and free from the responsibility of running a massive public company. And in this new quiet space, he discovered his final and perhaps most profound business philosophy, the power of simplicity. After the sale, the silence was deafening at first. For decades, his life had been a relentless storm of information, decisions, and problems demanding his immediate attention. His daily schedule, which once resembled an air traffic control board during a snowstorm, now had vast, beautiful stretches of nothing. It was unsettling. The engine he had been building and rebuilding his entire adult life had been switched off. But as the days turned into weeks, the unsettling quiet began to transform. It started to feel less like emptiness and more like peace. The absence of complexity, he realized, was the greatest luxury of all. He began to instinctively apply the Pareto principle, the famous 80-20 rule, to his entire existence. He looked back at his life and realized that 80% of his stress and wasted time had come from 20% of his activities, managing a massive workforce, dealing with petty corporate politics, and navigating endless regulations. Conversely, the true value, the joy of a smart deal, the satisfaction of building, the time with his family, came from a much smaller, more focused set of activities. And so, he began to prune. He embraced a philosophy akin to the Japanese concept of danshari, which involves 3 stages: refusing new clutter, disposing of existing clutter, and separating from the attachment to things. He began to practice this in every aspect of his life. He refused new, unnecessary complexities, turning down offers to run other large companies. He disposed of the mental habits of a corporate titan, letting go of the need to be in every meeting. And he separated himself from the emotional attachment to the symbols of success, realizing they are often just burdens in disguise. He concluded that complexity is like glitter. It seems fun and exciting at first, but it gets everywhere. It's impossible to get rid of, and it ultimately just creates a huge mess. His new business life reflected this. He no longer operated from a towering headquarters. He ran his affairs from a small, lean family office with a handful of trusted advisors. He was no longer an operator, managing thousands of employees. He was an investor, deploying his own capital into clear, understandable opportunities. The goal was no longer to build the biggest machine, but the most efficient and stress-free one. This philosophy permeated his personal life. The frantic accumulation of things no longer held any appeal. He came to realize that the ultimate luxury wasn't a yacht that could double as an aircraft carrier, but a phone that didn't ring with a new crisis every hour. The true measure of his wealth was no longer the size of his balance sheet, but the amount of unscheduled, unburdened time he had in his day. It was the freedom to read a book, to have a long lunch, to think without interruption. This embrace of minimalism was the final lesson learned from the trauma of the Zenon crash. The immense complexity of that business is what had made its collapse so total and terrifying. The simplicity of his current life was a direct, conscious rejection of that vulnerability. He had simplified his world down to the essentials, to the things he could control and understand completely. He had evolved. His first act was defined by addition and multiplication. More trucks, more market share, more leverage. His second act was defined by subtraction and division, selling assets, cutting debt, reducing risk. His third and current act was defined by a serene clarity, the pursuit of the elegant, simple solution. He found that by shedding complexity, he had not lost power or influence. Instead, he had gained focus, agility, and a profound sense of peace. It was the final quiet triumph of a man who had learned that the biggest prize in the game of making it big is the freedom to stop playing. The freedom to stop playing the game of accumulation brought with it a single clarifying question: what is it all for? He had mastered the art of making money, mastered the art of rebuilding, and mastered the art of simplifying. He had reached a state of financial peace that few people on earth would ever know. And in that quiet, unburdened space, he realized the final stage of the journey is not about what one can get, but about what one can give. His focus shifted from accumulation to contribution, from net worth to net impact. This is how he began to define his legacy. It was a decision born not of guilt or a sense of obligation, but of purpose. For a lifelong builder, the instinct is always to build. Having built a secure and simple world for himself and his family, the only challenge left, the only one big enough to capture his imagination, was to build a better world for others. His new business goal, he would joke to himself, was to get his net worth back down to zero, but this time, intentionally. He found it to be a much more interesting and certainly more rewarding challenge than his first attempt at getting to $1 billion. He was in many ways returning to the values of his childhood home. His father, Sir Michael Otedola, had dedicated his life to public service, choosing the path of politics to make his impact. He, having mastered the world of commerce, now found his own path to that same goal. He would use the tools he had, the vast resources he commanded, to serve the community. It was the fulfillment of his father's legacy, written in a different language, but telling the same story of contribution. But he was not a sentimental philanthropist. He did not simply write checks and hope for the best. He applied the same strategic, incisive, and disciplined mindset to his giving that he had applied to building his businesses. He had learned that just as in business, a lack of focus in philanthropy leads to wasted resources and minimal impact. So, he didn't scatter his donations across 100 different causes. He chose a few key areas where he believed he could make a transformative, not just an incremental difference: healthcare and education. He began to make headlines, not for his business deals, but for the sheer scale of his giving. A multi-million-dollar donation to a children's hospital, another to support the education of underprivileged students. His actions placed him squarely within a modern global movement of philanthropists, exemplified by initiatives like the Giving Pledge, who are reimagining the role of private wealth in solving public problems. He was thinking about giving on the same epic scale that he had once thought about business. He found himself trading corporate boardrooms for charity galas. The food was generally better, and people, he noted, were infinitely nicer to him when he was giving money away than when he was trying to collect it. His approach put him on one side of a long-running conversation. Development economists still debate the effectiveness of large-scale foreign aid versus targeted, local philanthropy in creating sustainable change. He firmly planted his flag in the camp of local, targeted impact. He was not an outsider trying to solve problems he didn't understand. He was an insider, investing in the future of his own country, funding institutions he could visit, and supporting communities he knew intimately. This principle of structured, significant giving is not a new invention. It has deep cultural roots, like the Islamic tradition of zakat, a mandatory and structured form of charity that has been a pillar of community support for centuries. He treated his philanthropic endeavors like his most important investment. He expected a return, not in dividends or capital gains, but in human impact. A return measured in lives saved, in diseases cured, in young minds given the chance to reach their full potential. He applied due diligence. He wanted to see the plan. He wanted to see the metrics for success. He had learned that having $1 billion is a fascinating problem. But he now understood that using $1 billion to solve other people's problems was a much more interesting game to play. This became his new work, his final and greatest venture, the process of converting financial capital into human capital. In doing so, he came to define what making it big truly means. It is not a number in a bank account. It is not the size of your company or the height of your public profile. It is the positive and lasting mark you leave on the world long after you are gone. This was the legacy he was now building, with the same focus, discipline, and vision he had once used to build an empire of oil and gas. And so he arrived here, not at a final destination, but at a high, quiet plateau from which he could look back and see the entire shape of the journey. From the governor's son learning about order, to the young man smelling the ink of his first struggling business, to the king of diesel commanding a fleet of ships, to the broken man in a silent office, to the patient builder of a new, stronger institution, and finally, to the philanthropist considering his legacy. It had not been a straight line, but a great, dramatic cycle of ascent, collapse, and recovery. And from this vantage point, the final lessons of a life in business became as clear as the stars on a moonless night. The first lesson was that everything is cyclical. Wealth, power, failure, success, none of these are permanent states, they are seasons. He had lived through the vibrant spring of his first success, the hot, glorious summer of Zenon's dominance, the brutal, bleak winter of the crash, and the patient, rebuilding autumn of Forte Oil. Understanding this removes the terror from the downturns and the hubris from the upturns. He had learned that life is the ultimate and most unpredictable business partner. It shows up late, changes the terms of the deal without notice, and occasionally sets the office on fire. But it also brings every single one of your greatest opportunities. Psychologists have a term for this resilience of the human spirit, the hedonic treadmill. It suggests that whether we win the lottery or suffer a terrible accident, our emotional state eventually returns to its baseline. He had lived the most extreme version of this, and he knew it to be true. Neither the ecstasy of being a billionaire nor the agony of losing it all was his final resting place. The goal, he realized, is not to chase the peaks, but to cultivate a peaceful, resilient baseline. The second lesson was about the illusion of control. In the height of his Zenon days, he believed he was a master of the universe, a puppeteer pulling the strings of a global logistics empire. The 2008 crisis taught him a humbling lesson. He was never in control of the global markets, the price of oil, or the hidden risks in the world's financial systems. He now knew that trying to control the great chaotic ocean of the market was like trying to teach a cat to file your taxes. It was a frustrating, pointless exercise, and in the end, you were just left with a lot of shredded paper. The ancient Stoic philosophers built their entire worldview on this insight. the idea that wisdom lies in separating what is in our control from what is not. He couldn't control the storm, but he could control how he built his ship and how he navigated it. He couldn't control when the market would turn, but he could control his company's balance sheet, its governance, and his own integrity. True power, he had learned, is not the ability to command the world, but the discipline to command yourself. Looking back at the dizzying turns of his life, it was easy to wonder about the forces that shaped it. Philosophers and theologians have for centuries debated whether human lives are guided by free will or by a form of destiny. Was his journey a series of calculated choices, or was he simply a character in a grand pre-written story, fated to rise, fall, and rise again to learn these very lessons? He found the answer somewhere in the middle. He did not choose the global financial crisis. He did not choose the family he was born into. But he chose his response to every single one of those things. He chose to start the business. He chose to take on the debt. He chose to sell the assets, and he chose to pay everyone back. He had come to believe that one cannot choose the music of life, but one has absolute freedom in how to dance to it. And that was the final, most important lesson. The destination was never the point. The purpose of the journey was the journey itself. The prize for making it big was not the billion-dollar fortune. It was the wisdom, the resilience, and the character that were forged in the fires of both his greatest successes and his most devastating failures. Peace, he had discovered, is not a result of one's net worth. It is a result of living in alignment with the principles he had fought so hard to learn: the discipline of structure, the anchor of integrity, the freedom of simplicity, and the purpose of contribution. He had found the secret to happiness wasn't having everything you want, but wanting everything you already have, especially a quiet mind and a clean slate. And so our story comes to a gentle close. The great storms of the market have passed, the frantic energy of ambition has softened into the quiet hum of purpose, and the journey of a lifetime finds its way to a place of peace. The lessons are not found in complex financial charts or secret business formulas, but in the simple, timeless truths that you have heard whispered tonight. The rise and fall of fortune is like the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing as you begin to drift off to sleep. There is an inhale, a moment of fullness, and an exhale, a moment of release. Both are part of the same single process of being alive. Let go of the day's complexities, the wins and the losses, the things you control and the things you cannot. All that matters now is this moment of quiet, this feeling of gentle release. The story is over. Your own journey can be picked up again tomorrow. But for now, there is only rest, deep, peaceful, and well-earned rest.